Hey, folks, thanks for joining us. We'll just give other people a few minutes to jump on before we get started. Thanks, everybody who's joined. Still giving everybody another minute to get on before we kick us off. Thanks for joining us today. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. It looks like we had about 50 people accept and have about 15 or so already on, but we are 3 minutes after, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Excited to see a lot of new faces as well as some familiar ones. So awesome to see you all. All right, so today you're going to be hearing from one of my teammates, really smart, intelligent person in this area, deep technical expert, Rob McKenna. Really going to be talking about how to leverage API management as an enterprise gateway. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. So this is one of our webinar meetings, but it does act like a regular Teams meeting. We just have some moderator controls in there. So right now, all of your mic and video is disabled. But towards the end, if you are have a really complex question, if you raise your hand or we decide I can go and unmute you, we would love for you to engage in the conversation. And participate in the meeting if you have, any questions or comments. This is being recorded and transcribed, so we will post the recording after the session. It usually takes us a few days to get that up, and then any resources that were shared during the session so that you can grab them later or share them with your colleagues. So I know you all sit in Teams meetings every day, but we want to make sure that you know how to engage in the conversation. Go ahead and use the chat, use the reactions up at the top. Give Rob a little thumbs up or a love or a happy, clapping your hands if you like what you hear today. It really helps the presenter with feedback and knowing that they're hitting the right note for you guys. So thank you. I just wrote, I'm from Texas. It's really sunny and beautiful out where I am. Would love to see where you guys are joining from. All right, so enough of me. Let's move on to the presentation. Rob, as I mentioned, is on my team, a deep technical expert in this area, and we're super excited to have him present to you guys today. Hey, Rob, how are you?
I'm doing well, Shelly. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Rob McKenna. I'm a principal technical specialist in Azure App Innovation, so covering anything app dev related, DevOps related in Azure, and part of our health and life sciences organization. So I've been with Microsoft for almost 4 years now, joined in 2020. And I work with a lot of customers on Azure integration services and a lot of work with API management. And specifically, you're leveraging Azure API Management as an enterprise API gateway. So we'll get into what that means. And this won't necessarily be a deep dive into what is API management or the individual functionality, but this is more of around the engagement that we've had with customers and the project orchestration, the getting teams working together to drive towards that goal of consolidating to API management from a single API gateway standpoint. So some of the things that we'll take a look at is the benefits of a centralized and shared API gateway, getting your enterprise team started. That's what I was talking about, the orchestration of the teams and who needs to be involved. Networking considerations for regulated industries. There's a lot of scrutiny on the network capabilities from health and life science customers in terms of the network traffic flow and what's accessible, what is not. So also talk about the API availability for both internal and external API consumers. So that's a typical question that we receive in regards to, well, if I have APIs that want to expose internally and expose externally, does that mean I need multiple API management instances? The answer to that is no, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And getting into improving the API developer velocity. We go through all of the above checkpoints and topics, and we really need to drive towards keeping developer velocity in mind and making the service and the flow of the APIs accessible to developers so they can focus on business logic and getting APIs out there to the API consumers, whether they be other internal development teams or maybe your customer's team of developers that is consuming your APIs. All right, so some of the benefits of a centralized and shared API gateway is really the reduction of the redundant services. So a lot of customers have a variety of development teams that have gone down different timelines, gone down a path of they have APIs, they have microservices, they know they need an API gateway, and they all may have individually set up their instances of API management, but this will bring those teams together and be able to share the instance and reap the benefits and some cost savings and some infrastructure overhead instead of having a variety of instances in play. Have a centralize it from an infrastructure standpoint, and we'll get into how you can take advantage of some features that will allow you to prevent teams from stepping on each other's toes. So we'll centralize the API governance. So things like authentication and authorization. Teams might have a variety of identity provider needs, whether that's Entra ID, Okta Ping, whatever that might be. If there's not a centralized capability, you are able to provide a breakdown of that access to internal and external consumers of APIs, as well as handling those varieties of identity providers. And when we get to the section on, I'll touch on the policy breakdown and products and subscriptions, and how we can slice and dice that that portion of handling multiple identity providers. Mentioned the regulatory compliance requirements around networking and the enhanced developer experience. So standardize on a central platform. Everyone knows where their APIs are going to land. And once they get into the flow of how to deploy those APIs, again, the infrastructure would be stood up. They don't need to worry about standing up a new instance of API management every time they have a new project or new applications, new products. They just know where their APIs are going to land, and it's a matter of how things are sliced and diced in terms of authentication and authorization. And that increased time to market, like I mentioned, once that infrastructure is stood up, it's well known, the DevOps pipelines are in place, and how teams can be onboarded onto the platform for API management and get their APIs migrated into API management or deployed for the first time. So to get your teams started, the typical trio to foursome of teams that are typically we're involved in conversations with are the infrastructure team, responsible for the networking and the security, the information security team that needs to oversee and lay the foundation for the guidance and governance around information security. Platform teams might be called the DevOps team, pardon me, and the application development teams. So that one or more app dev teams. So really, a lot of these our interactions with customers is not just, okay, it's a PaaS service, so it might be an app dev team, but all of the underlying infrastructure, the implications for app network security, as well as application level security with the authentication, authorization, leveraging protocols like OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, all of a consideration for the InfoSec teams, and then API ops for DevOps considerations and the developers getting acclimated with just using APIM in general and being able to be able to successfully deploy their APIs. So that's a lot of teams. A lot of timelines don't always line up for all these folks. So instead of creating roadblocks and say, all right, well, dev team can start once all the infrastructure is in place. That could take some time. That everyone has their variety of internal priorities and challenges with getting that infrastructure stood up. So my recommendation is parallel work streams to get started. What that entails is one work stream for the infrastructure considerations, the design and implementation, where in the network it will reside, whether or not you have internal or external API consumers. Are you going to do multi-region or single region with availability zones and front door app gateway, like I mentioned, identity providers, logging. So you can read through some of the rest of those, but really it's the establishment of all of the infrastructure side of the fence for all of the considerations for successfully standing up a Azure API management instance. And the other side being the API development teams or the platform teams that are building those APIs, those backend APIs, and exposing them through API management. They need to get going with skilling to know how to leverage API management. How do I add an API, import the open API spec, or link to other resources, Azure resources that I'm deploying, like logic apps, like app service, functions, container apps, and getting familiar with API management policies. So that's where the JWT validation comes in, where you have throttling and quotas, any transformation type policies. And if you haven't seen it yet, there is a co-pilot now for the API management policies. So you can just put in natural language text. I need to implement a JWT validation policy. It will then suggest the context of the policy, and you can paste that right in. Ask it questions about the policies of what this policy does. Very useful tool. It helps out a lot from the standpoint of you no longer just need to be staring at XML to figure it out. You have that Copilot to help and assist with that as well. So the other features, such as like policy fragments, which is reusable snippets of policies, versioning, revisioning. Credentials manager might not be necessarily a widely known feature, but that is if you are exposing APIs to your consumers, but one of them happens to be a third-party API that has its own authentication and authorization with the credentials manager. You're able to store those in APIM, and APIM handles the request for a token, retention of the token in a key vault behind the scenes, and refresh tokens if applicable. So that way, your consumers can only need to understand how to authenticate to your API management gateway, API gateway, and not every other API that might have a variety of credentials. And the development teams can get started with skilling up on API ops. So we'll go into that a little bit as well. That's basically the DevOps capabilities for API management. And also we'll touch on the VS Code extensions in terms of policy debugging and the API first design. So you see that there's definitely a two different paths to go down, and as you go through these, it's we're working with the infrastructure folks, information security folks, and the API development teams to get down a path where at some point the infrastructure is up and running, and now we can connect the dots and deploy to those API management instances and be on our way. So for the infrastructure side with network considerations, so we mentioned in healthcare, there's strict regulations in terms of how the data is governed, the network security, no public IP addresses permitted, no public access to anything that's not going through maybe a web application firewall, and really no, pardon me. So ensure that the API gateway meets the regulatory compliance. So really the isolation is where that comes into play. So that's a priority versus what you might think of as a PaaS service, which is just accessible over the internet and might have a login screen in front of it or accept an authentication token. But from a standpoint of the network related options, there's internal to the VNet, external, and self-hosted gateways. I have a couple of slides that will speak to on that. And then there's high availability and DR. So there's either a single region with multiple availability zones, being 3 data centers within a single region. That may be enough. And in that case, you start out with multiple scale units to populate however many regions, however many availability zones you're going to leverage in that region. And then the conversation grows into, do you need multi-region? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in short, is the availability zones in a single region enough? If not, now we replicate out to multi-region, and in that case, what we have is you have a primary region, you'll have your primary instance of your APIM service. You'll create a location, what's called an APIM location, in the secondary region. Now that won't be the full-blown service, but it'll just be the API gateway for that region to access. And then backup and API apps. Backup is typical backup to blob storage that can be restored should there be an outage. You could restore that to, of course, if you have a virtual network configuration, such as what I've been describing, then the expectation is that you stand up that same virtual network configuration in order to be able to deploy that backup of your API management instance. All right. So the external configuration, as you can see here, it's in a network, it's in a dedicated subnet. However, it's accessible to the public internet. Most likely not acceptable from in most cases, a security standpoint, because the preference leans towards the internal configuration, where external access to the public internet is cut off, and the network traffic is isolated to your network, and the only access to that instance is from administrators, but that is from a PowerShell, from the Azure portal standpoint, and not necessarily the API gateway. But that only covers part of the story, because now we're isolated and we don't have access from external parties, only internal resources. So the internal configuration with Web Application Firewall from the App Gateway Web Application Firewall. So we have API management internal to the VNet. We have contacting our backend APIs, and we have App Gateway in front of it. So now if you're on the network, you could send everything through the App Gateway if you desired. Your external consumers are going to be accessing it through that, and they're not just going to be accessing the API gateway, but also the developer portal as well. And then those internal to the network will have access to the API management gateway and the developer portal as well. So this is typically the ideal network configuration that we encounter based off of the typical networking and information security requirements of our customers. There's also a self-hosted gateway that it runs in a Docker container, and that is for when you have APIs maybe on-prem. So from a kind of a hybrid approach, a modernization approach where, well, we have these APIs, we're not ready to move the data just yet, and we need to expose those APIs, and we want to manage those in API management, which is a great step, because with the self-hosted API gateway, that provides you the capability to manage them from the API management portal in Azure, but those APIs and access to those is all on-prem. So the API management capability is closer to where those APIs reside. So that's more of a latency consideration. But from a longer term modernization, at least now you have that representation in API management. So then one by one, as those APIs are promoted to or moved up or migrated to the cloud, then it's a configuration and not necessarily any new endpoints, no new versions or revisions. Your front-end applications simply just need to point to a different URL, and then it should be a fairly seamless transition once those are moved eventually into the cloud, or maybe eliminated at some point because maybe you found something more cloud native and retired those. So whatever the case may be, the self-hosted API gateway serves a variety of purposes because there's the single data center, there's multiple, pardon me, and so there's multiple API gateway self-hosted configurations as well. So again, it helps with the modernization effort, and it helps with the latency of where those APIs reside today, and giving you that next step for further migration and modernization. Touch briefly on the backup and restore for DR. It says it usually takes about 10 minutes. So it captures all the necessary details behind the scenes of the contents, we'll call it, of the API management, not necessarily the networking infrastructure for it, but assume that you lay the foundation when you're going to restore that it matches your previous network configuration, and you'll be able to restore it. High availability with multi-region, as I described before, these natural progression of the conversations go from, are we in a single region? If so, then maybe the single region with availability zones is acceptable. In that case, in the event that you're exposing them to external consumers, then you have API or App Gateway in front of APIM, because App Gateway is a regional service, whereas if you're multi-region, now you're introducing likely Azure Front Door, which is not regional, it's cross-region. And so then from that configuration, you have that network service in front of API management. All right, so the APIs for both internal and external, like I touched on before, is the consumers, are they internal, are they external? The idea would be that you're leveraging the same API gateway. You don't need, like I mentioned, a typical question is, well, do I need to have two separate configurations because of the networking? And it really comes down to the management of the networking capabilities, accessing it or exposing it via App Gateway with Web Application Firewall. And also, there's also a routing that can be leveraged. So your APIs that are maybe external only or internal only, you can leverage a path-based routing and a prefix when you're setting these up in APIM, so that when your external consumers are routed to those, they follow that, pardon me, that path. There's also the concept of the products and subscriptions. Now, the typical scenario or example of use of products and subscriptions might be, gold, silver, bronze tiers of think of maybe the bronze is tightly monitored in terms of throttling and quotas, whereas gold is a little bit more unlimited. But it doesn't necessarily have to be those feature tiers. It can be more of a logical grouping of products based off of your needs of exposure, meaning you're grouping these products to a set of like customers. And again, a product is one or more APIs that you need to put in a bucket for some purpose. So those APIs for those purposes, for external, internal, could then also be tiered if necessary as well. So there's a wide variety of options that kind of get unlocked by thinking of products by a little bit more than just gold, silver, bronze feature tiering. Again, just to reiterate, the oops, pardon me. just to reiterate that configuration again, APIM internal VNet mode, app gateway in front, and then if you're going multi-region, then you're talking front door as well. Policies. So, oops, that figures. All right, so I put policies in here in terms of the networking considerations or the overall considerations, because I think it's important for both the infrastructure, the infosec, and the app dev teams to understand policies and where things, where certain policies will reside. And you have your typical global for all across the board. Product level is where I'd mentioned I've recently recommended this to a couple customers that might have had multiple identity providers. Is they might have multiple identity providers for a variety of customers, but it's the same APIs in the backend. So a single API can be exposed in multiple products. Then at the product level, for that categorization, that bucket, that consumer of that bucket of APIs, the policies can be written in such a way that I can put a JWT validation for product A, product B, product C, all applicable to those consumers that are my API consumers that are expecting a specific identity provider. All right, so improving API developer velocity. So there's a lot of overhead. There's a lot of infrastructure considerations, a lot of networking, a lot of security. And when it comes down to it, we want to be able to get to the point where the dev team doesn't need to be concerned with standing that all up. They can simply have an avenue for deploying their APIs where the system is up and I've already deployed my new API, whether that be the app service or a function or container apps or AKS. Now I need to expose it in API management. And one of the avenues to do that, the recommended avenue, is API ops. So similar to a GitOps approach, where you're leveraging what's called the extractor and the publisher. Those are a couple of console apps that run in your pipeline that interact with the Azure API Management REST API. And what those do is the extractor goes and gets what I describe as the contents of API management. That's your API definitions, your policies, your service info, products, loggers, and diagnostics. So all of that content, which is separate from your networking capabilities, your infrastructure. So as you plan this out, the infrastructure could be stood up with Terraform or Bicep. So if you're standing that up, though, what I would recommend is not bringing in the deployment of individual APIs into that same set of pipelines. I recommend 2 pipelines, again, for that parallel path of work streams, one for the infrastructure to get that out the dev, QA, staging, prod, and then API ops for the individual contents of API management, which is, like I mentioned, API definitions and policies. So as a developer, I've created that API in API management. I can run the pipeline, which runs the extractor, which goes and pulls the contents into source control. And now I have JSON and XML files, which is the inner workings, the inner content of API management. It then creates that pull request, which then can be reviewed and approved, and you'll be able to see that granular change. There was a prior DevOps toolkit for APIM that was an all or nothing ARM-based deployment, which got unwieldy based off of once you hit a certain number of APIs. But that was an all or nothing. Whereas this is, if I just change one line in a policy, that's the only thing that changes here. And the reviewer sees that, can give the okay, and promote that to the next environment. So that publishes it out. And then again, you'll have staging APM, pardon me, pipeline stages to get those out to the other environments. One of the challenges with API management as an enterprise API gateway is the multiple dev teams. And there is a functionality on the way called workspaces that's in preview. So I'm not going to necessarily go into that. There's actually a great API event next week, next Wednesday, the Microsoft Reactor is putting on. We'll put a link to it in the chat. But there's about 15, 16 topics. This is one of them. So I highly recommend signing up for that and taking a look at the folks that build this are the ones going to speak to this. They can speak to it in much finer grained, at a finer grained level. But what this does from what I mentioned was workspaces, the concept there is enterprise API gateway, and every team gets their slice of a workspace. You can do that now with API Ops by slicing up your dev team's pipelines. There's configuration files that say, all right, here's my APIs. And so I'm going to group my APIs for dev team 1, dev team 2, dev team 3. So there's 3 pipelines. I could have a 4th pipeline that only focuses on the kind of cross-cutting concerns, global details. So from that standpoint, you could do that today with API Ops and have multiple dev teams sharing API management as an enterprise API gateway. An example of how it looks in Azure DevOps. Now this is a merge approval that's about to take place, so you can see what the differences are. There's instructions for how to configure API Ops for both Azure DevOps and GitHub. And here's just a sample of what you end up with. So this captures, the artifacts of, like I mentioned, the contents of API management. So here's my list of APIs, and underneath of each of those, I get the API information file, the policies, and the specification YAML, my backend configurations, my logger configuration, named values, policy fragments, products. So all of that is now source controlled and puts it into a format that developers are more in tune with in terms of what they work with on a daily basis, rather than having a web API developer need to focus on something like Bicep or Terraform. So that's where the infrastructure folks that are lining up the infrastructure as code, they might go that route. I highly recommend this approach for developers to keep that keep that developer velocity. Now, that's not to say that the Terraform or Bicep approach can't work. There may be solid reasons to go that approach for your organization, but this is just touting this as a approach that my colleagues and I have recommended quite a bit. Staying on the developer velocity topic, Visual Studio Code has the Azure API Management extension, and this is really helpful from a standpoint of, we may write a bunch of policies, and you may be staring at it in a bunch of XML, and you don't really know how it's going to play out, but the extension allows you to debug through that. So that's tremendously helpful for troubleshooting, or just to seeing if you're trying something out in terms of writing a policy. Maybe you're writing some C# code snippets. So again, I'd highly recommend not making the policies too complex. If you need a certain level of logic, I'd start to then use the policies that allow you to call an API and put that logic in a function and get a result. But even so, as you leverage policy fragments and JWT validation policies, all of that, you're able to track through that and step through it and test it from Visual Studio Code, which I think is an extremely helpful feature. There's also this design first, so you can scaffold an Azure function, and it makes it very easy to get the API created, get the Open API spec created, and get that imported into your API management instance. Another key for developers, now this is either developers that are internal or developers that are your external API consumers. Setting up the developer portal, it's self-hosted and customizable in terms of the look and the feel, but this is the standard out-of-the-box look, allowing you to test the APIs, able to discover the APIs, understand what APIs are available, what are the endpoints, what are you expected to send and receive, as well as there are you're able to configure the identity providers. So we mentioned the variety of identity providers. Let's say that you're using Entra ID. You can configure it in such a way that I'm a developer, I log into the developer portal, and I'm subscribed to this product. The subscription key would already be set, and it would already have it would already go and get for me the access token. So there's a lot of juggling sometimes when there's the identity providers are a challenge in terms of, okay, I have my Postman script. I'm going to go get a token, and I'm going to go here and I paste it here, and all that copying and pasting can be eliminated by proper configuration of the developer portal and tying into those identity providers that are doing the authentication authorization for your APIs. So you'll be able to integrate that and make it a bit more seamless for the API consumers. All right. And the other developer velocity functionality that I find tremendously useful is the application insights. If you have the app insights, that telemetry configured for your front end, your API management, your backend APIs, all the way to say SQL Server database, this came in tremendous. It was tremendously handy in a troubleshooting effort I did a number of years ago, where we're building out the platform, adding APIs, and we get to the point where there's a roadblock, a bottleneck, performance is degrading. And so we drill in and we're able to see this application map. We're able to see, all the resources and their dependencies. And what we saw was the increase in failures or degrading performance between an API and the backend database. And we were able to drill in beyond this level that you see here of the application map, but really drill in and see the individual transactions, and then into the transactions see the actual SQL statement, and then identify that, well, there was some not very well written entity framework code, so the queries weren't efficient to the database. We needed to identify some new indexing, and all of that was exposed thanks to application insights, and we're able to refactor and resolve those issues. But again, that made it tremendously easy to identify those bottlenecks and keep the development moving along. All right, so that was pretty rapid fire, a lot of information thrown about. But in terms of emphasizing the benefits of centralized and shared API gateways, is really reducing costs. So you're not replicating multiple instances of API management and not necessarily managing that infrastructure in a duplicative manner. Pardon me. So then getting your enterprise teams up and running, getting everybody on the same page, and the understanding what the network options are relative to your maybe your information security regulations and governance, and as well as the being able to expose APIs to your internal teams as well as your customers and expose them externally to API consumers. And in all of that, keeping in mind, again, the improving and maintaining that developer velocity, because we've set up a lot of infrastructure, a lot of practices with DevOps practices with API ops, and we really want to get to that point where that sweet spot where we have all of that in play, API management and all the identity providers and all the network is in place, and I, as a developer, just need to have that. I have new requirement. I need either enhance an existing API or a brand new one and have an easy avenue to build it, test it, debug it, and bring it into APIM easily, debug those policies, and be able to investigate the App Insights telemetry in order to be able to keep everything rolling and get the reduce the time to market, get the products out there, and keep your customers happy. So that was that's all that I had. I don't know, Shelly, if we are going to take hey Matt, take any questions. I don't think I see anything in the chat, but I don't know if we were going to open it up or not.
Yeah, I was going to start by saying thank you for all the info here. It's always fun to be on the at the front of the room, going through a bunch of content, so you can take a quick sip there. So yeah, for anybody in the audience, if you do have questions, feel free. If you want to use the hand raised feature, we can unmute if you want to be able to ask live. You've got an expert here in Rob to be able to help with that. Otherwise, you can go ahead and make use of the chat for any of those questions. So we'll just give it a minute here for folks to do either one of those. It looks like we have a comment or a question that came in from Dave here through the chat. So it says, you can configure the user/owner for a subscription. What's a good practice for that user? For an app registration configured to use OAuth for server-to-server requests, client credentials flow. Rob, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So are we talking about when you create a subscription in, I think what Dave means is when a subscription is created with the intent of that server-to-server request, who owns the app registration or who owns the subscription? So I think from a subscription standpoint, there's a difference between being in the developer portal and be able to sign up for a subscription versus what you might produce as a subscription key for your customer. So that process might be a little more regimented than the subscription I sign up for and get approved of in the developer portal just for testing and development. But that official ownership, so who should own the subscription administrator, is a choice, but doesn't seem like a good choice. That's a good question. I can take a look at that and provide some feedback. I think if we're talking app registration ownership, or if we're talking dev team or developer portal level subscription ownership.
If it helps, Dave, I did make your mic available for you. So if you care to come off mute and just ask the question live, sometimes that can cut through some of the typing or interpretation question.
Sure, will do. So we were looking through the APIM logs and noticed that for almost all of the requests, the regardless of the subscription, the administrator was the user in the logs. And we believe that's related to the subscription, right? It's been configured with administrator as the user owner. And I said user owner because in the screen where you can look at the subscription, it says owner, but then in the logs, it says user. So, and you know, when you see administrator as a user anywhere, you kind of think twice and you think, is that a good idea? So it seems like it's the user/owner that's tied to the subscription, not the app registration when the request comes in. So that was really the question. Is there a good practice for configuring the owner of a subscription?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I can take that and try to look that up, or you know, ask the product group. I think from a standpoint of usually with the subscriptions, there's the developer portal. The testers have their own subscriptions from a development testing standpoint, but when it gets to a more regimented, I have a customer that's going to call my APIs, I might have a more rigid process for creating a subscription ID.
Right.
And at that point,
that's what we were thinking. Like we have a production client using our APIs, and their requests in production come through as the right subscription, but with administrator tied to that subscription.
Yeah, and I think if you wanted to create a user that represented them, that's another step that you could take.
Like a service-based account.
Yeah, it would be a APIM level account, or some user in AD. But if that's from what I'm seeing, that what I'm thinking is that user, because you, the administrator, administrated that subscription. They didn't sign up for it. They signed up with an agreement with you as an organization to consume your APIs.
I see. So it could be that an administrator in this case, that's correct, because then they could control the subscription as well.
Correct. Yeah, because you could disable it, regenerate the keys if necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is that so? Which way do we come down on that? Is it that administrator is the proper owner for the subscription, or would it be better to have a service-based account? At least in the upper environments.
A great question, and I don't have a specific answer for you, but I can look into it and provide some feedback. If that's okay.
Cool. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for coming with the question, Dave. All right. If there are any others, go ahead and pop those into chat. Oh, looks like we did get another one here from Matthew. You want to take a peek at that one, Rob? I can.
Sure. In API Ops, is there a slick way to manage prod and non-prod APIM instances within a given repo pipeline? Promote changes from non-prod to prod, or would they need to be separate? So there is, and I'll share that link. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add reference links to the slide deck, and I'll share it into this chat. But as you look through the repo and the workshop around API Ops, it talks about configuration files for a specific environment. So that there's a configuration environment out of the box when you clone the repo called prod, but you'd create one for QA and prod. Your dev configuration is what your repo is, because that's where it's extracted from. But as you go from dev to QA to prod, it leverages those configuration files, and that is where everything kind of becomes environment variables, specifically like the backend URL. Maybe all the policies and everything is the same for an API from environment to environment, but you're going to deploy it to QA and prod, and that QA and prod API has a different URL. So that's one of the values that you need to change, or something like a named value that is specific to an environment, or like a key vault reference. So those environment specific values can be controlled by those configuration files. I don't know if that helps, Matthew, at all.
Matthew, I did enable your, see a thumbs up there. So there we
Thumbs
go.
up.
Excellent.
And again,
All
there's
right.
a Microsoft Reactor event next Wednesday that I'll follow up here with the link to that. There's it's all API management related. API ops is one of the topics there, as well as 15 or so other API related topics.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Rob, and thanks everybody for joining. Want to do just a quick reminder that for the Intelligent App Chronicles for Healthcare, we do this webinar monthly. We do have our next session topic set for the March session, which is going to be platform engineering and AI. Still working on setting a final date, but that is going to be in late March. So looking forward to having you join us for the next one. As a reminder, all of these sessions are posted to the HLS blog, which is, you can find it at aka.ms/HLS blog. We'll put that in chat as well for those who are live in the session. With that, unless there's anything else, we can go ahead and sign off. Thanks, Rob. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks, guys.